Hello, my name is Alondra Rosas. I will be discussing the topic of queer camp films. My project is titled Queer Cinema, the Camp Aesthetic. It will explore areas such as the meaning or definition of camp, the history of the camp aesthetic, the evolution of camp, the impact/significance of camp to the LGBTQIA plus community, and some examples of beloved camp classics. First, what is camp? Before we examine the history behind the concept of camp, we must first come to understand the meaning of camp itself. Camp can best be described as a form of creative expression that is often deemed absurdly exaggerated, theatrical, silly, stylized, or appealing to an audience because of its playfulness and bad taste. It is an aesthetic style that is over the top, self consciously artificial, eccentric, and of ironic value. The term camp has often been used to describe phenomena that are subversive in their interpretation of both beauty and good taste. Camp is typically used to describe either someone's behavior, personal dress style/extravagant fashion, or one's performance style. In this particular case, I will be bringing attention to the use of the camp aesthetic within film. While camp in movies may be difficult to define in words, one can rest assured that they will be able to know or comprehend camp upon seeing it on screen. Camp films are known to draw on exaggeration and euphoric excess, e.g., magnifying something to the point of absurdity where it's so bad it's good. Camp is a sensibility that celebrates theatricalization, irony, or the outrageous, and it undermines the typical cinematic qualities. In the 1964 essay titled Notes on Camp, Susan Sontag attempts to define the camp aesthetic. The manner in which she decided to do so is one that still aligns with the idea of camp today, or camp as we know it. Sontag expresses that camp is a certain mode of aestheticism. It is one way of seeing the world as an aesthetic phenomenon. That way, the way of camp is not in terms of beauty, but in terms of the degree of artifice, of stylization. Susan Sontag used the concept of camp as not only a vision, but as a way of looking at things. She goes on to describe camp as something man made rather than something found in nature, as opposed to the literal notion/meaning of camp. Sontag makes a clear distinction between works that are camp by chance or by accident and those that are camp on purpose. These two diversions of camp are referred to as naive and deliberate. Naive camp being films that do not intend to be seen as camp by the general public, but end up fitting within the category of camp. Deliberate camp refers to films that seek to be campy, or camp which knows itself to be camp. Sontag argues that naive camp is pure camp and much more satisfying than deliberate camp. Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp is one of the very first pieces of writing to bring the sensibility of camp to mainstream consciousness or to the general public. Next, history of the camp aesthetic. The exact beginning of the camp aesthetic is largely unknown, but the origin of the term can be traced back to late 17th century France in the court of Louis XIV, better known as the Sun King. Both Louis XIV and his younger brother, Philip I, Duc d'Orleans, are generally recognized as prominent figures in the formalized beginnings of camp. Louis XIV is credited with augmenting the popularity of ballet and influencing fashion, e.g., the use of red high heels and winter/summer prints. Philip I, Duc d'Orleans, was known for his more feminine tendencies, such as his interest in wearing extravagant female attire. The Irish poet and playwright Oscar Wilde can also be deemed a major influence in the inception of the camp aesthetic. Wilde had an affinity for the artificial. He lived and breathed camp. In Wilde's perspective, the first duty in life is to be as artificial as possible. But the second duty is, no one has yet discovered. Oscar Wilde's efforts helped form the art of a highly stylized and self-consciously artificial aesthetic. Wilde's work is what made the camp aesthetic become more directly associated with queerness itself, Christopher Isherwood made the first attempt to describe the concept of camp in the 1954 novel The World in the Evening. Initially, the term camp was used to describe those who were viewed as outcast, in connotation with the queer community, but in a negative way. Camp used to solely be associated with the queer community until the concept became more mainstream. It stopped being perceived as something negative once it became mainstream. Susan Sontag went on to further expand on the meaning of camp, which brought the concept to the general public's attention. The evolution of camp. The modern camp aesthetic was solidified by Susan Sontag, specifically the previously mentioned 1964 essay, Notes on Camp. With the rise of postmodernism, the camp aesthetic and the individuals who strongly resonated with the concept were seemingly becoming more accepted by mainstream society. This gradual acceptance can be felt and seen more clearly in the later decades of queer camp film, particularly the 2010s and the 2020s so far. Queer camp films from the 1960s usually fit into the diversion of naive camp, which meant that they weren't purposely striving for a campy feel. Quite a few of these films, including Roger Vadim*s Barbarella from 1968 and Mark Robson's Valley of the Dolls from 1967, weren't inherently queer, but they heavily attached queer audiences. They heavily attracted queer audiences. Queer spectators would view these stories and find queerness in things that weren't explicitly stated to be queer. As noted by Brett Farmer, the aforementioned process is one of appropriating or queering films. During the 1970s and 1980s, certain films began to fall within the category of deliberate camp, as directors sought to create projects that could be deemed excessive or shocking to audiences. This aim for deliberate camp can best be demonstrated through films such as John Waters' Pink Flamingos from 1972, Female Trouble from 1974, Polyester from 1981, and Hairspray from 1988. The late 1990s and early 2000s consisted of a mixture of both diversions, naive and deliberate camp. In the history of camp cinema, Amy Ferrier explains how many of the films created during this period of time were shunned by critics upon release due to their perceived absurdity, even if the directors had aimed for deliberate campiness. However, years later, films such as Jamie Babbitt's But I'm a Cheerleader, Darren Stein's Jawbreaker, and Angela Robinson's Debs have earned the title of camp classics. In the 2010s and early 2020s, a great deal of the films considered campy by queer audiences have employed both naive and deliberate camp. There appears to be more refreshing takes on the concept of camp lately, through films such as Todd Strauss Skousen's The Final Girls from 2015, Helena Rain's Bodies, Bodies, Bodies from 2022, and Emma Seligman's Bottoms from 2023. Although it can be argued that the camp aesthetic isn't as prevalent in the current day, with the modern definition of camp being misconstrued as solely bad films by mainstream culture, Amy Ferrier emphasizes that camp films, intentional or accidental, deserve more love and respect. There is so much to love about the camp movie canon, and to shun these films as unworthy pieces of trash is to deprive yourself of some fantastically enjoyable cinematic experiences. The impact of camp. Since its emergence, the camp aesthetic has been a significant aspect of queer culture. It can be viewed as a somewhat amorphous concept that is deeply intertwined with queer identity. The style of camp means something slightly different to everyone within the LGBTQ+ community, but there is one common theme in nearly all interpretations. Camp demonstrates a full expression of oneself, and it has taught us to embrace all of who we are. And Benjamin Wong's words, this kind of distinction and appreciation is part of what constitutes the rather vague concept of camp art. Camp is about accepting the wild and messy parts of ourselves. It is a vision of the world that disrupts our notions of what art is or can be. The artifice and stylization of camp allows us to feel pride in our identities and to see the beauty in being our true selves. Many of the early queer camp films were brought to life during an era in which queerness was regarded as a sin. These films created a safe space for queer individuals to be themselves and create connections with other members of the LGBTQ plus community. The camp aesthetic has made it possible for various individuals to feel a genuine sense of comfort with their identities. Aside from helping with self-expression, the camp aesthetic continues to be driven by the resistance/disruption of binaries and the inversion of beauty standards. The camp aesthetic is a pillar of LGBTQ plus culture, and its relevance is still seen to this day with more and more films becoming camp classics treasured by queer individuals. Lastly, camp classics. The following films have been recognized by queer audiences as camp classics due to their exaggerated writing, silliness, satirical techniques, theatricality. These films have earned or cultivated a cult following over the years. John Waters' Hairspray from 1988. John Waters has been famously referred to as the king of camp due to his ability to traverse beyond the scope of our imagination. His dark comedic work can be considered the epitome of camp as he deeply explores the grotesque and defies heteronormative constructs. Katie Duggan points out that his films explore the abject and transgressive, the people and ideas cast out of the mainstream. John Waters understands exactly how to make the audience squirm, and this is done through centering his films on outsiders or oddities. He often takes the audience out of their comfort zone by having the plotlines revolve around sex, crime, filth, or a combination of all three aspects. Duggan further maintains that Waters' work destabilizes and dismantles typical standards of beauty. The parody of ideas concerning what can be considered beautiful or proper in the eyes of society is specifically explored in John Waters' Hairspray. The film Hairspray tells the story of Tracy Turnblad, a young teenage girl who auditions for a spot on a popular dance show known as the Corny Collins Show. She joins the program and becomes an overnight dance sensation in 1960s Baltimore. Tracy uses her newly earned place on the dance show to advocate for racial integration after seeing the discrimination experienced by her Black classmates. As stated by Duggan, the protagonist of Hairspray, Tracy subverts the expectations of the atmosphere of racism and fat phobia. Tracy is comfortable/confident in her own body, and she manages to rise against the standards set by society. Hairspray transgresses boundaries through the resistance of beauty standards and the creation of a space for those deemed outsiders. Hairspray is the literal definition of camp because of its melodramatic tone, deliberate exaggeration, big hairstyles, and moments of complete outlandishness. Despite the film not being centered on queer characters, there is a certain queerness that permeates the story from Divine's performance as Tracy's mother to Tracy's iconic roach dress. Suzanne Woodward describes the casting of Divine as Edna Turnblad as queering the working class nuclear family. Divine played the role of Edna in such a realistic manner that the overall campiness of the performance became all the more effective. Woodward also mentions that Divine invents a whole new version of femininity in Hairspray. Divine is not parodying feminine stereotypes, but instead putting his own spin on what femininity can be or destabilizing typical standards. Jamie Babbitt's But I'm a Cheerleader. Babbitt's But I'm a Cheerleader stars Natasha Lyonne as Megan, traditionally feminine cheerleader, who is suspected of being a lesbian by her family and friends. Megan unexpectedly gets sent to True Directions, a gay conversion therapy camp, where she meets a diverse range of individuals and discovers her true feelings for women. Queer audiences are drawn to this particular film because it provides positive representation of the community and raises awareness about the harms caused by conversion therapy. But I'm a Cheerleader pokes fun at the general public's narrow definitions of queer identity and deconstructs heteronormativity through the use of satire. The film can be deemed a camp classic because it never takes itself too seriously. Instead, it openly acknowledges its own campiness and uses it to highlight the stupidity of gender roles. But I'm a Cheerleader has a certain level of absurdity and access to it that makes the love story aspect of the film that much more satisfying to its viewers. The film's color palette, the acting, and the story itself are filled with glorious moments of camp, reminiscent to that of John Waters' films. Angela Robinson's Debs from 2004. The film Debs tells the story of a team of teenage crime fighters/spies, Max, Janet, Dominique, and Amy, who are tasked with surveilling Lucy Diamond, an infamous supervillain. One of the Debs, Amy, has been having some doubts concerning her future as a spy, which leads her to become distracted during their mission. The Debs blow their cover and a shootout ensues at the restaurant. The aforementioned incident causes Lucy to bump into Amy and gain a romantic interest in her. Their relationship is initially not approved by the Debs due to some previous misunderstandings, but they eventually gain their approval. Robinson's Debs was a commercial failure when it was first released in 2004, but it has gained a cult following in the past few years due to its campiness. The film is considered camp because of its over-exaggerated/absurd aesthetic and its artifice of femininity, from the Debs uniforms to the relationship between Lucy and Amy. Debs does not take itself seriously, but it never once mocks the queer love at the center of the story. It is simply a fun, shallow, and campy lesbian love story. These are the 3 movies that I mentioned for camp classics: Hairspray, But I'm a Cheerleader, and Debs. Thank you.